Gremlins! I just moved, so I don't yet have a set background for filming. So for now I'm filming on the floor with just some random furniture in the background. This will change once I'm a bit more set up. Today's project is a project that is 2.5 years in the making, and that entire time has been spent slowly collecting fabric from various thrift stores. I finally have enough. So today's project is going to be turning this beautiful amount of various shades of foresty green fabric into a really cool patchwork skirt that I've been planning to make for a while, and have only just now acquired enough different fabrics to be able to fully realize my vision. I'll talk to you more in the voiceover. I figured out the pattern for this skirt a couple of years ago with some help from Garnet the Gremlin's sister, who did some of the math for me. Now I have 3 different paper templates for the different sizes of patch, and I'm testing that all my fabrics are large enough to get at least one patch out of, which they are, thank goodness. I'm also now figuring out the layout of patches, which fabrics will be next to each other and on what layer of the skirt. There will be 24 patches total, 8 panels of 3 patches each, and a few of my fabrics will be providing 2 patches. These I've marked with some of the fabric samples that I had pinned together to bring to the store for the last few years and check any new finds would fit into my color scheme. When I had all my fabric laid out and rearranged it until I was happy, I cut them out off camera, and here is the result. I have all my patches cut out, and it looks so good all laid out next to each other. I'm so excited about this. My next task is to pin each of these panels together, so the top, middle, and bottom. And then I have other things happening today, so probably I'll stack these all in the order that I want to sew them, and then put them aside for now. Yeah, this is gonna look so cool. I'm so excited about this. Again, this is a 2.5 year in the making project, and seeing it like in the actual stages of being made rather than just a box of fabric is so exciting. So anyway, let's get to pinning. In order to keep my fabrics in the order I've decided on, I'm going panel by panel and stacking each pinned set of patches neatly so that I can keep the layout consistent later. I'm pinning right sides to right sides. Basically, the bottom patch is facing up and the top patch is upside down, so that the inside fabrics are the sides that will be visible when the skirt is done. I'm also making sure that all my pins are oriented in a way that I can sew over them at the sewing machine for efficiency. For each set of patches, I'm double checking that the pattern edges I traced onto the fabrics when cutting them out are lined up, and while it isn't perfect, being as careful as I can should keep the end result from being warped or messy. My panels are all pinned together. This is what they're looking like. And the next step is to sew them. While I sew these patches into panels, I'm going to talk a little bit about the backstory of this project and the steps it took to get to this point. I got the idea of making a patchwork skirt from Pinterest, where skirts like this are a common item in various goblin core and cottagecore style inspo images. I also, before I started tertiary education, was traveling around the country on a gap year and thought that collecting 24 fabrics from thrift stores would be an excellent goal to achieve. So I figured out the measurements I'd need for these patches, figured out what color scheme would best fit into my wardrobe, and got to hunting. My only rules were that the shades of green had to work well together, and that I would not touch anything stretchy or too delicate for the sake of my sanity. Every time I found a fabric candidate, I'd cut off a small sliver of the edge and pin these samples together, bringing my fabric scraps into thrift stores with me to check any new finds would fit into the color scheme. Some fabrics would just be big enough for one patch in my estimate, while others were large sections of old tablecloths or sheets that could be used for multiple projects. However, finding shades of green that were perfect proved more challenging than I expected, and when I'd finished traveling around and settled in my chosen city to begin school, I still didn't have enough different colors and patterns to realize my vision. So I kept hunting, and acquired some free cloth from some friends who clocked that if they had any spare green in their stash, I was the person to give it to, and decided that some of my fabrics were large enough that I could make 2 patches out of them, and it wouldn't mess with the skirt's vibes. And so, about a month ago, I finally got my hands on the final green I'd need, and got to move on to the active stage of this project. The panels are all now sewn, and the next step is I need to fell all these raw edges so that the skirt doesn't fray through wear. That part of the process I'm not going to film. That's going to be done by hand sewing. It's probably going to take a couple days of just me sitting and sewing while I watch movies or anything like that. So I'll check back in a couple days when I'm ready to get back to the major sewing sections, the next step of which will be attaching all the panels to each other. I did all the felling of the inside edges that I needed to do. A demonstration of what that looks like. And the next step is pinning the panels together. I'm just going to pin flat, so the final seam, the one that will make it into a tube to be a skirt, will be done later. I don't actually know what order is best to do things in, which is why I'm starting with doing all the flat seams, and then I'll figure it out from there. It's been a while since I've done a skirt this style. So anyway, that's the next step. Before I started to pin, I laid all my skirt panels out in order, making sure that they were correct and still looked good like this. Again, I'm pinning right sides to right sides, so that the sides of these panels visible on the final product are facing each other while I pin. And again, I'm making sure that my pins are oriented so I can sew over them, to avoid having to stop and take pins out as I go. Skirts and I have an interesting relationship at the moment. I loved them growing up, but after starting to question my gender and realizing I was non-binary, I started thinking that skirts were too girly and moved away from them, even getting dysphoria from wearing them because of worrying about how I'd be perceived. However, I still like skirts and want to be able to wear them, so over the last year or so, I've been slowly working toward divorcing this item of clothing from gender and figuring out how to wear skirts in a way that still feels gender-affirming to me. As you can see in this clip, I'm wearing another skirt I made on this channel with mushrooms all around the hem. Because wearing goblin-y or foresty clothing is very gender-affirming for me, making skirts that fit that vibe help make them a lot more approachable, and I'm really hoping that this patchwork skirt will fit into that category. I immediately ran into technical difficulties when I started trying to sew the panels together. After trying to troubleshoot, repeatedly restarting my sewing and then stopping to remove the mess of thread embedding itself in my fabric, and messing with the bobbin repeatedly, I finally realized that I hadn't threaded the machine correctly and the machine was complaining about it. I rethreaded my needle and the issue was fixed, letting me start sewing properly. Every time I finish a seam, I go back and remove all the needles before moving on to the next scene. It's very repetitive, and I had Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood on to rewatch as I worked as entertainment. Really, I can speed through this whole section. Sewing one seam looks much the same as sewing another. And when I finish sewing all these seams, I'll go back to fill all the raw edges by hand, folding the seam allowance into each other and sewing it with quick running stitches. I only started doing this step after one of my previous sewing projects went through the washing machine and came out with every seam fraying, and now it's a step that I never skip, and it makes my sewing projects much more long-lasting. With the skirt now sewn, but for the final seam that will turn it into a tube, the next step is the waistband. I'm using some of the unpatterned fabric left over from the patches for the waistband so that it's unobtrusive but matching. First, I measured the top of my skirt and, off-camera, marked the measurement onto the waistband fabric. Then I cut out a rectangle of fabric, estimating how wide it would need to be based on the width of my elastic and the fact I've sewn waistbands like this several times before. I pinned the waistband right side to right side along the top of the skirt, making sure that no matter how uneven the top was, the waistband would have enough seam allowance to surround all my raw edges. I'm sewing one side of the waistband to the skirt, then also the side seam to turn the skirt into a tube and add the elastic before finishing the other side of the waistband. I pinned that final side seam, doing my best to make sure that all the other seams from the patchwork and the waistband lined up, and then I sewed the skirt closed. I did talk to the camera about the next step, but unfortunately both my head was completely cut off and my mic was not positioned very well, so I was barely audible. So I'm just restating everything I said here in the voiceover. I've threaded the skirt through my waistband elastic, which I sewed into a circle off camera, and my plan is to hand sew the waistband around the elastic. I could do this by machine, but every time I've sewn a waistband by machine, I've made a mistake somewhere that warps the fabric, so I'm willing to take the extra time to do it by hand instead. Even better, doing it by hand and with whip stitches means that the stitches won't be visible on the outside of the skirt. I'm not showing the whole clip of me sewing because it took over an hour and isn't that interesting to watch, but I got it done through the power of watching a show and locking in, and the waistband does look really good, so I'm glad I did it this way. I sewed some belt loops off camera, and all that is left to do is hem the skirt. It's already all pinned in place, and I've decided that I'm going to hem it by hand because I have a thread that I think will match the skirt color really well, but I don't think this thread will survive the sewing machine, so I'm going to just hem the skirt by hand. We'll see if I regret that, but this is the last step, and then it'll be on to the reveal footage. I'm not going to film the hemming, so the next thing you'll see, the skirt will be done. I still don't have a proper backdrop, so we're just going to film this in front of my bedroom door. I'm so proud of this skirt. There's a couple things that I maybe should have factored in. It's not quite as spinny as I thought it would be because the panels aren't quite as triangular, but I still really like how it fits. The seams are noticeable on the inside, but it's not too irritating, and I think wearing like leggings or something underneath would completely fix that, or even an underskirt. So that's not too much of an issue, and given that it's all patchwork, I probably should have expected some level of seam noticeability. And I'm just so happy with how it looks. I've been inspired by like Pinterest images and stuff for years, and the fact that I finally have my own patchwork skirt is so exciting. Also, I really enjoy the process of patchwork. So now I'm tempted to figure out what other things I can make with patchwork, especially since I have a bunch of material left over in this color scheme that works really well together. I'll have to think of some more things to make. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Until then, bye!